because
good. All right. Welcome everybody. It's funny because I'm kind of welcoming you to your home because I am a guest too. So I was very pleased to be invited to last month's meeting, and I missed a lot by not following my emails closely. So I'm really grateful to the Phages for Africa community. And today we have one of the greatest supporters and sponsors of African Phage community. She brought us all together a few years ago in Evergreen, and I would like to welcome Dr. Tobi Nagel. She holds a PhD from Harvard MIT, which is impressive. My son is now shopping for universities, and that's on the top of his list. My surprise is that I thought Tobi was a biologist, pharmaceutical industry person, but she started as a medical engineer actually from Harvard, and she spent a few years, I will not say how many, working in pharmaceutical industry. She has been involved in over 80 clinical trials, which is a rare expertise that we all need, because in academic science we fly over a lot of ideas, but we don't know how to translate our ideas into products and how to convince the regulatory agency to. I mean, we have learned a lot about this during the COVID vaccines development. And then the best thing happened is that as we were just chatting a few minutes ago, Tobi got, like many of us, like all of us, attracted to the phage world, and it's like a very positive suction power, because it's a magnetic power, but it's a freeing power at the same time. So she founded, gratefully, Phages for Global Health. She's the founder and president, and she focused on the least privileged, financially privileged continents, Asia and Africa, which is very good, I think. And she has been building a lot of resources, many workshops. I don't want to. If I introduce Tobi, I will take the hour that she needs because she did a lot for Africa, hands-on workshops in collaboration with many people, and then she got also research projects and grants, almost $1 million, and she taught phage courses. She leads currently a project called Combating Antimicrobial Resistance in Africa and Asia, and she works with a lot of collaborations with Ayman Shibini from Egypt. He's one of the pioneers of the phage community in Egypt, reviving the phage community in Egypt. Lillian Mozilla from Camry and other professors. I don't want to take so long. I know that Tobi will talk a lot about herself, and we only have almost an hour now, less than an hour. So please all virtually welcome me with some emoticons welcoming Tobi Nagel, and she will tell us in a couple of minutes about how she transitioned from medical engineering to this moment, and then she will tell us how to get $1 million as well. Tobi, please, the virtual floor is yours, and we're all really eager to hear from you.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and it's nice to see you all virtually. It's been a long pandemic, so it's good to be connecting. Rami asked me to tell you a little bit about my background at the beginning. It's cold here in California, so even though it is spring, so I just turned the heater on a little bit. So my degree was in medical engineering, my PhD, and my focus there was on the cardiovascular disease. And my motivation there was wanting to have a big impact on human health. And cardiovascular disease through stroke and heart attack still is the #1 killer around the world. So I wanted to have a big impact there. And my PhD actually focused on the fluid mechanics of blood vessels and how that determines where we get hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis, which leads to heart attack and stroke. And I looked at how the fluid mechanics regulates gene expression in the cells that regulate or lead to the atherosclerosis. So that's where I started. I then went I postdoced in Genentech, a company, as a way to decide for me really if I wanted to go academia or industry. And there I worked on drugs that were for inflammation, really, with atherosclerosis being a piece of that, or one example of that. And I discovered how incredibly hard it was to make drugs against a disease like cardiovascular disease that is multifactorial. So how we eat, how we exercise, our genetics all impact on that disease. And so it's hard to have one drug, excuse me, that will impact that disease. And I saw a lot of the companies around me closing their cardiovascular departments at that time, which was frustrating. So I went through what's called the angiogenesis field into the cancer biology field, which is how blood vessels feed tumors to keep them growing. And if you can stop the blood vessels growing into those tumors, you can stop the tumors growing. So that was how I got from cardiovascular into the cancer field, which is a bit easier to develop drugs for because often it's one mutation that drives a cancer. And so you can imagine targeting the gene that is mutated for that. And so then I spent a number of years in the cancer field developing cancer drugs. In the end, my last company, I went back to the cardiovascular field, and we were working on trying to actually regenerate heart tissue after a stroke or a heart attack. And actually after a heart attack, or similar types of biology in the kidney or in the brain. And so, but I must say, through all of that work, including my first postdoc before I did two postdocs. First, I went to Istanbul, Turkey, and I worked in the American hospital there on a rare genetic disease where I studied patients' blood cells. And it was a bleeding disorder called Bernard-Soulier syndrome. It's been a while since I worked on that. And throughout all of my career, my heart kind of has been in lower and middle income countries. And so I often consulted on the side while I was working in companies. And in one of my side consulting gigs, I ended up in the country of Georgia, working with people from the Eliava Institute, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the famous Phage Therapy Institute in the former Soviet Union. And throughout my whole life up till that point, professional life, I'd been living in these two worlds of developing drugs that are really expensive, like $1 billion for a given drug to be developed, and then consulting in developing countries where frankly, that drug would never be accessible. And that was frustrating for me to see those two worlds. And so when I was in Georgia working with these people from the Eliava Institute, I learned about phage therapy for the very first time. I remember the moment because I had been looking for a technology that could work in lower and middle income countries, LMIC, that could more cost effectively be developed in LMIC. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the type of technology that could be more accessible in countries like that. And that's eventually how Phages for Global Health started. It was another year or two after that, but that was the beginning. So I took a few minutes to do that. Now let's jump into grant writing and scientific communication. Feel free to stop me if there are questions. I don't have the chat open, so somebody might need to speak up.
So yeah, I'm taking notes of the chat, but I think because of the limited time, and we really want to know the core of it. So maybe you can keep going, and I will mark the questions. And if someone needs clarification, I will ask Tobi. Otherwise, I will let you all ask your own questions in the end. But I will take note of the questions in order they were.
Sounds good. And just so you know, I've got about maybe 30 minutes of slides, so we'll have some time at the end for that. Okay, so these, of course, I'm going to focus on grant writing, but as we're going through the different things I'm talking about, keep in mind that most of what I'm saying could apply to scholarship or fellowship applications, manuscript writing, poster presentations, even oral presentations, though that's slightly different, and even a little bit to CVs. So keep that in mind too. But overlying all of these things are differences in cultural norms that you need to keep in mind. Essentially, it comes down to know your audience, right? And so I'm going to highlight a few places where things might be done differently in other countries than in your countries, and where it would be helpful for you to know sort of what those norms are, okay? So these are the key topics I'm going to discuss. Finding sources of funding. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on that because that's not easy. And also determining if a grant is appropriate for you. Strategically thinking from the funder's perspective, making realistic statements, and double checking your spelling and grammar. Don't minimize that either. That's really important. Again, I think that could be one of those cultural norms where English is used differently in different countries. So I'll talk about that. So starting with finding sources of funding. And again, this could apply to research grants, fellowships, scholarships, travel awards. There are 4 things that I'm going to discuss. Organizations that have previously funded phage work in Africa, go to those. Those are ones we know will work, right? I have a short list that I'm happy to share with you that I often share with people that might work for you for smaller grants at least. There's an organization, a website called Funds for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that I find very helpful. And a simple Google search, but I'll give some suggestions for how to make that more productive. Okay, so starting with the organizations that have funded phage work in Africa. Let me just ask this, can you see my title? I see the you're sharing your screen over the title so that it's partially blocked.
Yes, that's the silly Zoom thing, but you can actually hide the floating thing, but we can see it very well.
Okay.
You
so
can try to
floating,
click on the hide floating thing,
got it.
But it comes back though.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. So you may know that a few months ago, I published this paper, A Brief History of Phage Research and Teaching in Africa, with Ivy, who's on this line, and Martha Cloakey, and Theo, who is also in Martha's lab, who helped, Theo and Ivy helped us pull together a lot of the publications and references that we included in this paper. I know this paper is not open access. We're working on getting that to be open access, but Ivy, feel free to share this paper maybe through the Africa Phage Forum WhatsApp after this talk. And the reason I highlight it is because table 2 lists, in that paper, lists the organizations that I'm aware of that have provided funding for phage research and teaching in Africa. And some of these have provided it for our workshops, for your research projects, for some travel awards. So, and I would love it if you're aware of any other organizations to please email me or even tell me at the end of this, because I want to keep a running list of who has published or who has funded this. I think, is somebody asking a question or just not on mute? So then here is my short list of funders. And again, I'm happy to share this with the Africa Phage Forum WhatsApp group later, so you don't have to write it all down now. But these are, maybe half or more of these have already provided funding for phage work in Africa. The others, I suspect, would if they haven't already. And so those are ones that are worth your checking out for small grants on the order of a few thousand to maybe $20,000 equivalent, or travel awards are significant in many of these organizations. And regularly check out their websites. If they have newsletters, subscribe to their newsletters so that you get notified when they have new funding calls. So we'll share this list later. And then I mentioned this fundsforngos.org. And it's where I found a lot of my grants, to be honest. You can subscribe for free, and then you will get regular notices of new grants that might be available. Not all of those, in fact, most of those will not be relevant. You do have to sift through them to find the appropriate ones. You can also sign up a paid prescription for this. I'm not convinced that's necessary to get what you need out of Funds for NGOs. I'll show you how I have gone about that in the past. But you can also click on by a country basis, look at your country. And so as an example, I clicked on that link and then I searched on Ghana for what grants were available for people in Ghana. Something like 6,000 funding opportunities were there. On the very first page, I had to scroll down, but I found this one, which is due next week if anybody is interested, the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Regional Program. And if you click on the read more, it gives you some of the details, which include this one. There'll be 15 doctoral students could receive 10,000 euros and 5 postdocs could receive 15,000 euros each for different projects, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a great opportunity, right? But sometimes when you click on the read more in some of these announcements in funds for NGO, you get to a paywall where you can't actually get the details unless you have a paid subscription. I find that's not so limiting, because then what I did in this case, you could also just search on L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Regional Program, the title, and you get straight to the web page, the L'Oreal web page that has this call for applications, which is due in 10 days. So that's a great resource. I would really recommend spending some time, and you will need some time. So spend some time with that website. And then another one is Google search, and really play with the keywords. Look for grant, funding, opportunity, travel award, and your keywords might be AMR or infectious diseases or global health or One Health, all these different areas, depending on your specific interest. And again, really play with some different keywords and see what you can find, combinations of keywords too, and choose broader ones. So wound instead of diabetic foot ulcer, if that's what you're working on, or diarrhea instead of the specific disease, or food safety or poultry instead of salmonella. So then those are sort of the topics and the keywords, and the other keywords might be your location, sub-Saharan Africa, lower and middle income countries, or your specific country names. I actually find that sometimes specific country names, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, work better than just listing Africa when searching through Google for grants opportunities. And again, use different words that indicate the types of funding or the career level, depending on what you're looking for. So I really recommend playing with that and using these types of keywords even in the fundsforngos.org website. Sit down with your cup of tea and plan to spend an hour or so and just sort of surf through it and see what you can find, then take a break and come back and do it another time. I do this every few months. I just sit back and say, I need some new funding sources. And I spend an hour or two doing this kind of searching where I find sometimes some new opportunities. Here's an example where I did a Google search and I came up with the IDRC, which funds the project that Angela, I believe, is working on at ILRI. And I thought, oh, maybe they have a new call. And well, it's not really an appropriate call because it's really about chronic diseases, which tends to be more heart disease or diabetes, things like that. But at the bottom of that page, it had signing up for funding alerts. So I made sure that I was on their email list so that I'll get notified when they do have another call about infectious diseases that might be appropriate for one of our projects or one of your projects. I often try to send out funding opportunities through the WhatsApp groups. So get on many email newsletters. I am on a zillion. And I spend a little time every day quickly screening through them to see if there's any opportunities that we should take advantage of. Okay, so that was finding sources of funding. Now I want to talk about determining whether a grant is appropriate for your project. I think this is hugely important. It saves you from wasting a lot of time, and I'll give some specific examples. think from the funder's perspective. What do they want? Not how do I convince them necessarily that they really want to work on my project. Really figure out what do they want, get in their mindset. So for example, are they looking for AMR surveillance or treatment? If everything in their grant has the word surveillance in it, focused on AMR, and you really want to develop a phage cocktail to treat poultry or something, this probably is not the grant for you, because they really want surveillance. They don't want treatment. If, on the other hand, you're developing a diagnostic using phages, well, then maybe that might be an appropriate grant for you. Okay, and don't waste your time if it really isn't the right one. Another one that's often confused me, do they focus on healthcare or health technologies? Healthcare is typically clinics. How do we get better health care to patients on a day-to-day basis? That's different than developing, say, a health technology or a new health innovation. And so really look carefully at how are they wording things and make sure you're not interpreting it wrong in terms of what they're looking for. Read all the grant guidance in detail, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. For some of the things might be, do they have country or institution requirements? Do they require matching funds to come from your institution? And ultimately, what motivates them? Get inside their head by reading everything you can about them. And again, I'll give you a specific example. One thing I find really helpful is look at past projects that they've funded. If they've made it available through their website, do any of those projects look similar to yours in any way? And they might not be a specific phage project, right? But maybe they're working on unique new interventions for infectious diseases or something like that. If they look completely different than yours, maybe it's not the best fit for you, okay? And ultimately, if you're still not sure after doing all that, contact the funder, email them if you're able to. Often they have an email for asking questions. Keep that email concise, to the point, ask a specific question or maybe two. And you might even need to follow up a week, 2 weeks later if you haven't heard back. But keep that really short so you don't, frankly, annoy the funder. Just stay on point. A key thing is to not annoy funders in how you write, in how you ask questions, that kind of thing. Don't inundate them with questions. So here's an example of an inappropriate grant. We, as you know, with KEMRI, Phages for Global Health, had funding from the UK government for a poultry project to develop Campylobacter phages, and I was looking for more funding, and I looked at this organization whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce, Ekagastiftelsen, I'm not sure. They're a Swedish foundation, and the purpose of the foundation looked good to me from the beginning, to promote human health by supporting the development of better food, natural medicines, and healing practices, and to support research for a healthier way of life. This includes applications in the agricultural and food areas, where the focus should be to find methods that can prevent various problems. So at first reading, I thought this might be good for developing Campylobacter phage products for poultry. And then I read a little bit more about the founder on their website, Gustav Videgaard, the founder of Ekagastiftelsen, and they highlighted the fact that he was a vegetarian. And I thought, well, would they then be interested in funding a poultry project if he was a vegetarian? And that sort of drives the important values for this foundation. So I emailed them and asked that question, and they said no, they would not fund a poultry project. Good to know. I didn't waste my time further on that. So that's an example where it really pays to understand, what are they thinking about? What do they really want? So to summarize then, finding an appropriate funding opportunity, there are more grants available than you think. There's some funky ones out there that are for a specific country to do a specific thing in maybe even a specific county. You'd be surprised what you can find. So spend some time on the web and find those. but spend also some time figuring out if it's the right grant for you. And keep in mind that success rates are not great. Maybe 10 to 20% of submissions get funded. For a few grant opportunities, it's more than that. For most, I would say it might even be less than that. So apply multiple times to multiple funders. I know that Jessica Nakavuma in Uganda, who has the big grant with Evans in Ghana, working on safe fish, phages for tilapia, Jessica had submitted, I think it was at least 4 grants before she got that grant, and none of those were successful, or only minimally some small grants. So keep that in mind. You really do need to apply multiple times before you have the success. So those were the first 2 topics, and now I want to jump to the next 3 topics. And I think we're going to have plenty of time here for questions. Strategizing, keeping things realistic, and double checking your details of your text. So strategize the themes first. So any given project proposal can be written in different ways, emphasizing different things. And so understand what the funder cares about. Are they focused on AMR? Are they focused on agriculture, capacity building, STEM innovation? Do they want something that will help women or children? So maybe there's a particular infection that primarily affects children. Then you might have an appropriate proposal for them. And you could write the same proposal, really propose the same work, but emphasize the importance of it differently depending on what the funder cares about, okay? And it really, again, comes down to understanding your audience. What do they know? What don't they know? And spend time explaining what they don't know, but don't spend too much time explaining what they already know. So if they are an AMR fund, you don't need to explain AMR to them in more than maybe a sentence or 2. Or if they are a phage fund, I wish there were one, maybe you don't need to spend too much time explaining phages to them. But maybe they need to understand how a poultry farm works, and therefore how your intervention might be important, that antibiotics are overused in poultry farms or something like that. So I hope you understand what I'm saying here is emphasize or spend more time, more text on what they don't know than what they do know. Again, this could be an area of annoyance to them. Maybe they are a big AMR fund. So if you spend 2 paragraphs explaining AMR to them, that's kind of a waste of their time. They don't need that, okay? So that's strategizing about the themes. Also strategize the writing itself. Before you start writing, outline the proposal. What are the key points you need to make? What order should you make those points in? And which sections of the proposal might be best for you to make those points? I try to map that out before I start. And I actually typically have 2 documents when I write. One is my outline and one is the document that I'm writing. And I refer back to the outline regularly to make sure that I'm on track. And sometimes when I'm writing, I realize, oh, I actually do need to rearrange the order of the points, because now that I've thought it through more, it makes more sense. So I'll change the outline, then continue writing. So use that to keep you on point, to not repeat things. Yeah, and really to help you highlight your main points. Make your specific goals very clear. I'll give an example in a moment. Use section headers as appropriate. I'll give another example. That helps your readers sort of categorize what you're writing rather than just having one big long text. And most importantly, or also importantly, be concise and easily understood. Don't use long, complicated sentences if you don't need to. Don't repeat key sentences, rephrase them instead, because if I find when I'm reading something, if I see the same sentence over and over again, or a very similar sentence in different sections, I feel like, didn't I already read this? So if you can rephrase it, I find that helps. Keep it interesting, frankly, for your reader. And so here's an example of some clear specific aims that you might include in a proposal. The goals of this project are to identify the key bacteria that infect tilapia fish in Uganda. You can imagine where I got this this example idea from. Isolate phages that can kill those specific bacterial strains, and then finally determine an optimal phage mixture for decontaminating tilapia. Very clear, not that complicated. Even somebody who wasn't a biologist probably understands that, right? That's pretty straightforward. And notice how I've structured this too. It begins with, there's a parallel sentence structure. Begins with, in this case, verb that's in the same tense in all three cases. Keep it balanced like that and sort of in a common format. Now here's an example of using section headers, and this is too much text. I don't expect you to be reading all of this, but the section headers clearly tell you right away what we're after, right? And this is actually from a proposal that I wrote with Jan Zhang and Jessica Satcher of Phage Directory a few years back. And within the project summary section, we wanted to highlight these three things, at least. The global antibiotic resistance crisis exists, phages are antibiotic alternatives, and we're providing training in phage biology, or we want to if you'll give us the money. See how the section headers really help so that it's not just one big block of text. You really already know, even if before you read the details, what this is about. This particular application was one of those where you need to copy and paste into an online portal. And in online portals, I find that you cannot format like bold or underline. I often use bold or underline for section headers if it's in a Word document, say. But in online things, you can't do that, which is why I use all capital letters then in this case. So that's a trick that I think is valuable. This also reminds me to tell you, in this particular case, we were limited to 2,500 characters. And when you're working online, you don't have a choice. Typically, you cannot go over those characters, or you can't click the submit button. But in cases where you're not limited in an online format like that, still respect the character limitations. Again, this is a way that if you don't respect the character limitations, you can really annoy a reviewer. They're reading zillions of proposals to determine which ones should win. You don't want to annoy them by not following their guidance, okay? So stick with the character limits. Then let's talk about making realistic statements and proposals. I would say really work to avoid generalizations that are too broad. Be specific instead, and I'll give some examples. The first is an example for a grant proposal. You might, in your introduction, want to say something like, phages are broadly used to address AMR. Well, that's kind of true, but not fully true. More specific sentences would be better. Maybe say phages have been used for 100 years in certain regions of the world, or phage products have been approved by the US FDA for food applications, specificity there. Or approximately 30 clinical trials are currently ongoing, phage clinical trials. And I do want to point you to this website if you're not already familiar with it. Clinicaltrials.gov is where many, not all, but most, I would say, clinical trials that are running in the US as well as elsewhere are registered. And you can see the details of those trials, and you can search on the word phage or bacteriophage, and then you can sort them by clinical trials that are currently running or that have now closed or haven't started yet. And I check out that website every 6 months or so and take a count of where do we stand and how many are at phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3. I think we might only have one that's at phase 3, if that, at the moment. So again, here's examples of being specific rather than making overly broad statements. Here's another example, say for a CV. I have vast experience working with AMR pathogens. Instead, be more specific. Over the past 6 years, I have worked with 3 types of food bacteria, or I have isolated and characterized as 2 phages phenotypically as well as genomically, or I've conducted both in vitro and in vivo experiments with phages. Again, be really specific. And I think this applies also when writing letters of recommendation. Those are really important for fellowship and scholarship applications. Rather than saying this person works diligently and has a lot of experience training people or doing different types of experiments, be very specific. This person over the last number of years has worked with this number of phages or bacteria and has done these very specific types of experiments. I think that will really help a reviewer understand more specifically, more concretely, what this person has done. Also propose reasonable goals, timelines, and budgets. The reality is that reviewers are more likely to approve realistic plans and objectives as opposed to overly ambitious ones. You might be tempted to think, well, if I'm ambitious, they'll like that. If it's overly ambitious, they'll realize that it's not realistic. Also keep in mind that things usually take longer than you expect. And determine your detailed costs ahead of time as much as you can. So here's an example. I write grants to fund our workshops. And a big part of the funding for our workshops is flying people from different countries. Say our last workshop was in Tanzania, and we flew people there from Kenya or Uganda, Ethiopia. And so my flight costs, I need to figure out as I write that grant. And I literally go to a travel website and I look on how much will it cost me to fly somebody from Nairobi to Dar es Salaam. And then knowing that I'm actually not going to book those flights until 6 months to a year from now, because I first need to get the funding, then I need to accept the applicants into the workshop, then I need to book their flights. I take the costs of a flight for today and I multiply it times 1.3. So I increase it by 30%. And I find that works pretty well for me, actually, because by the time I get around to booking those flights, that's how much it's going to cost. I usually come in just barely under budget on my flight expenses because of that. So that's one practical example. Be as detailed as you can and realistic as you can. So here's an example. I'm going to go back to these clear, specific aims that I highlighted before. You could imagine that you could add a fourth specific aim, which might be to optimize a dry powder formulation that does not require refrigeration of those phages. And we had a project that we proposed recently for a neglected tropical disease that occurs in West Africa, Buruli ulcer. And we were looking at a funder who would give this amount of money for 3 years. And we felt that we could do, say, 4 steps. They weren't these exact 4 steps, but we could do 4 steps with that amount of money, but we would need 4 years to do it. We tried really hard to figure out how to shorten it to 3 years. And we just didn't think we could. We really needed 4 years for all of it. So we removed our fourth specific aim because we just couldn't do it within the time frame that they asked. And we were still tempted to ask for then the full amount of money that we could, but we realized we didn't need the full amount of money for the 3 steps if we weren't going for all 4 steps. So we asked for less money and removed the 4th specific aim. And I think that's important. Sometimes it's actually valuable for you to ask for less money. That worked for us for the Campylobacter project. I think it was a factor for us because grantors would like to give money to as many different groups as possible, often. And if they've got everybody asking for the maximum amount and maybe a little bit over sometimes if you can get indirect costs included, then they only have a little bit left. And if you're one of those smaller grants, then maybe you're enough for them to squeeze you in. Does that make sense? So it's a strategy we've used, I think, effectively, at least for the Campylobacter project. Now, don't minimize the importance of this step, double checking your spelling and grammar. And this is because English is used slightly differently in different countries. And there is roughly a general standard for international science writing. And tools such as Grammarly, which I believe is free, typically follow this general standard. Microsoft Grammar Check I've found isn't actually that great at
No, yeah, you're right.
catching errors. You would agree? That's helpful. Their spell check is pretty good in Microsoft, but the grammar check is not that good. And so really, I really encourage you to use Grammarly, see what it's like. I don't know if there are other tools also out there that people are aware of. Phage directory has Instill Science that's been offered. I don't know that you can at present ask for a full manuscript to be reviewed through Instill Science, but you may be able to get feedback on specific parts. And then also, I just want to say that there's a rule of thumb for plagiarism. I have a friend who used to be an editor at Nature, the science journal Nature, and I asked her, there's sometimes a gray area about plagiarism. What do you, and she said the rule of thumb that they typically use is roughly 7 words in a sentence. I think those words might not have to be in order. So you could imagine rearranging those words from the original source. It might still be considered plagiarism, or maybe 7 of those words are the same and one has a very close synonym. That might be plagiarism. And that it's easier to do this than you might think, to basically have plagiarism. Sometimes when I'm trying to write something, I'm looking at other papers and I think, oh, that sentence is perfect. They just say that just the way I'd like to say it. But I need to come up with a different way to say it. And if I can't in the moment, then I might put it in my text in blue or in a different color, and definitely in parentheses, and then put a special note to myself in the document that says, this is copied directly from this reference, change it before the final version of the paper. And so it's really, really important that you find ways to really reword something rather than copy it. I have to work to do that too. So those, I think we've wrapped up in about just over 30 minutes. Those are the key topics that I've discussed, and I'm happy to take questions now if there are any. I think I'll stop sharing screen now.
Well, maybe you can keep the screen for
Sure.
If somebody has a question related. Tobi, this is really amazing. I want to go back to this video actually, because you told us how to write a grant, and through your example and good example, you also taught us how to make an efficient presentation. I'm really impressed because you said every word that matters. I'm not exaggerating. It's really amazing and to the point, but still very detailed. Thank you so much. So I think we should open the floor for questions, but maybe first, if anybody has a clarification question before we start asking for further details, is everybody, is it clear to everybody? So let's now, while if anybody wants to ask a question, I think we are not numerous, so just raise your hand, and then we can start also collecting questions from the chat. So I see that Angela already has a question. Maybe she can read it. Angela, go ahead.
Hi, Tobi, nice presentation. So how do you deal with when you're budgeting and you have very high institutional overhead? Is there a way you can go?
And maybe you can say first what an overhead is for those who haven't written a grant yet.
Yeah, it's a big deal actually sometimes. So an overhead might be, say you have budgeted, okay, I need this for specific, this much money for specific aim 1, this much money to implement specific aim 2, and so forth. But then your institution typically has overhead, that additional money that they ask for, that says, we need money to keep the power on and the lights running and have administrators and that kind of thing. And so funders usually put a cap of somewhere between maybe typically 15 to 20, 25% more that you can add on to. Those are either called indirect or overhead costs. Some funders, many funders that I've gotten money from, simply do not allow overhead funding. So you can't add that 15 or 25%, which is frustrating because, yeah, your institution is going to take that money or want that money. So you may have to go for another grant that you wouldn't outline as just covering the overhead costs, but that you would outline as covering another piece of one of those strategic aims or something like that. So, Angela, I know that you come from an institution that has very high overhead costs, and I'm sure that makes it challenging, and I wish I had a better answer for that. And maybe the focus is that you only go after funders that allow overhead costs.
All right, great. There was, I saw another question being typed, but I cannot find it in the chat, which is very curious. Tabitha, Tabitha, can you hear me? Or she was writing a question, and I don't know where it went. So Tobi, I will ask you a question while looking for more questions, because it was really good for you to introduce yourself in the beginning. I think it's a key part, because spending like a few years in industry is not to be belittled, right? You learned a lot there. Can you tell us how this affected your work now as an NGO and as a grant writer? You know how to address the key questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, drug development is an interesting thing in that it's not something you really learn in school through a course. It's really something that you learn by doing. And I remember realizing that when I was first working as a drug development scientist in a company the first few years, realizing there's practical things about making a drug that you just can't learn any other way, which is it's a weird mismatch, if you will, in our field. And so, for example, all of your experiments are primarily done to get you to the end point of having a drug. And so there might be some really interesting science over here that you want to go do. Sometimes that's relevant to understanding how your drug's going to work in the clinic, and sometimes it isn't. And so you really do need to stay focused in that direction. Also, I think I made the point earlier that things take longer than you expect. That's a piece of the reality check, if you will, that is more built into. I have a better understanding of that now, having seen it takes 10 years to make a drug, at least a traditional drug. I think phage-based drugs can be made faster because you can isolate the phages more quickly, but understanding that time is going to be needed, choices are going to need to be made about what not to do as much as about what to do. I hope that helps some.
Yeah, thank you. And I found a question from Tabitha. She is an undergraduate student pursuing medical microbiology. And the question is related to this. So not the stage of applying for a full grant to do research, but she's asking how she can get scholarship funding for her master's degree. And she's from Kenya.
Yep. And so some of the short list of funders that I showed, I believe some of those might include some master's degree funding. But all the Google searches and even the funds for NGOs.org search that I talked about with the keywords, use the word scholarship or master's degree. And then all the other guidelines that I gave about using keywords are really still relevant. You'd be surprised at how many master's degree scholarships are available out there. Yeah.
All right. There is a hand raised. Amos, please take the microphone.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Tobi. Thank you for this presentation. Sometimes some grants, they request that you have a prime scientist from a developed country as a collaborator. Yet, they're asking for maybe phage therapy in one of the neglected tropical diseases in Africa. Yeah. So for okay, let me just ask it openly. Like, how would you go around it? Because sometimes it's very hard for someone who is new to get such people, to access such people who are so prime that they can collaborate with you. Because most of them would go for people, maybe they already have history together, or
Yeah.
they've done some work together already. Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. So
yeah. So I would say two things come to mind, and it's a challenging problem. Well, first, let me acknowledge that. One thing is it's valuable to build these relationships before you see a specific funding call. So sometimes somebody who I talked with 2, 3 or more years ago, suddenly now it's appropriate for us to be writing a grant together, because we've already built the relationship, that sort of thing. So take the opportunity to reach out to some of those people, or if you're at a common meeting, go up and introduce yourself if you're at a conference or something like that. So use your opportunities early to get to know people is one. Second, if you do have a connection with someone who can introduce you to that person, that can be key. I'm often happy to help with that. I'm sure Rami is, Martha Clokey, many others from our workshops are really willing, I think, to help. And if you're not already signed up in LinkedIn, linkedin.com, you can search, say you want to connect with somebody. Does somebody you know, are they already connected with them on LinkedIn? If so, maybe they're willing to introduce you, and starting with an introduction is better than a cold call. So I would recommend that as well, and start building up your LinkedIn connections too, so that those are in place when the time comes for you to need to ask for a collaborator like that.
Yeah, and definitely go to meetings. And because of COVID, well, the only advantage probably of the COVID pandemic is that now we have so many options of hybrid or online meetings. So as Tobi said, that just meeting somebody over in a coffee break during a conference makes a big difference. You know, you don't have to attend all the talks or anything like that, but the side talks and the coffee break and the dinner, this is how you meet your collaborator for 10, 15 years ahead.
Newton has a question.
Were you going to say something else, Amos? First?
Yeah, it was just more of a perspective. There's this notion going around, like, for example, if you're somebody who is new in grant writing, like a new early career scientist, even if it might just be within your vicinity, any grant that you write, put in maybe a high profile scientist who has already gotten some grants already before. So probably the funders, when they look at that, you have a bit better backing. I don't know whether is there some truth in this thing, or maybe you can just go for it one-on-one, or maybe as a team, who of you are new career scientists on a call that maybe requires only a career scientist. Yeah.
So I think you're asking, do you really need a big name to go for a grant? I think it helps. There are some funds, some grants, where the specific names cannot be seen by the reviewers, where they're only reviewed on the content. That's kind of cool, I think. I think Gates has done that, Gates Foundation, at least once. But those are less common. I think it does help you. I don't think it's totally necessary, but I think it does help you.
Thank you.
So there was a question from Miriam Garriga about how can junior researchers, such as master students, prepare themselves for funding opportunities later? What would be the steps to develop oneself? And then the next question will be from Newton.
Yeah, and I think getting scholarships is a good way to build yourself up for getting grants later. So if you can already put on your CV that you've won 1 or 2 or maybe even more scholarships, or won a poster award at a conference or something like that, that builds you up already as having some success that you can point to when you apply later. I think that's helpful. Get publication, that really helps. If you're able to get a travel award and go spend time in a phage researcher's lab who's more well-known, that person then can then write you a letter of recommendation that's very personal. I think that can really help as a step up as well.
Milton?
Yes, thanks, Tobi, for your presentation. My question is just, what is your experience with African researchers on grant proposal writing?
You mean, I actually haven't seen a lot of people's grant. I've seen some proposals, but not a huge number. Are you asking, can you clarify more what you're asking?
You say?
Can you explain a little bit more what your question is?
It's just a general question. It will enable us on the continent to perhaps come up with effective grant proposal. That was in this perspective that asked the question. But because you know very well that most of the funding agency are from actually Western region. So that was this is the reason why I asked this question. Thanks.
I think there is a lot of opportunities from TWAS that you showed, Tobi, right? The World Academy of Science. It's very, very focused on southern, I mean, the sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. But sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I think
you can say more.
That's exactly it. There are some funders who only fund Africa, and it takes some finding those, either from my shortlist, from Funds for NGO, from a Google search. And I think those are set up because you're right. A lot of the funding does come from the US or Europe or elsewhere, Australia maybe, and people tend to give money more to those organizations that are known in those regions. But there are plenty of funds available just for sub-Saharan Africa that I think you can find.
Right, so it's 6:03 now. Should we have maybe 5 more minutes of questions before we wrap up?
Sure.
It's
Samuel.
It's 8 a.m. in California, right? No, 9 a.m.
Because of daylight savings time, it's 9 a.m. Thankfully.
Samuel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tobi. My question would be, so I have actually had the opportunity to apply for grants locally across Europe, Germany, and a couple in the US. But then I tried to apply for a grant to make research back in Africa, basically Nigeria, and then there were hurdles. So my question would be, what are you've listed a lot of do's, things to do to get a grant. So what are the don'ts? Things you should not do, you should avoid as much as possible when applying for a grant?
Yeah, there were some don'ts in there in my presentation, such as, well, don't forget to do your spell check. Don't or your grammar check too. Don't overstate what you can do, or don't make too broad, too general statements. Don't have a budget that's too large, or frankly, don't have a budget that's too small. Yeah, really sort of stick with what's appropriate. And I think it's reasonable to add a little bit extra like I do with the flights, but that's kind of because I know 6 months or a year from now, the flights are going to be more expensive. Those are the key things that come to mind. Also, don't overstate what the potential benefits of your work could be. So say you're working on a neglected tropical disease that impacts 5,000 people a year in your country. Don't state that you're going to save 100,000 people, be realistic in stating. So for example, when I say that the impact of our work could be in the long term, I make it clear it's in the long term, to save thousands of lives. Possibly millions, though I'm a little uncomfortable saying millions. I think from my perspective, since my work empowers many of you, and each of your work might save ultimately thousands of people, my work might add up to saving hundreds of thousands of people. You see what I'm saying? So I'm realistic in the numbers of what I say. Yeah. Be realistic in how many years it's going to take to have a product where you impact poultry or people or whatever too. Essentially, build trust, and in general, I think scientists, that's our role, is to not overstate what the value of our science, but to make realistic statements so that people trust that what the impact we're proposing will really happen.
Okay, so speaking from experience, there was one of the grants to make a kind of collaboration back home. One of the things they were like was off, at least for the German government, was stating some of the facilities that would be using, and they were like, okay, this is nice, because I mean it's basic phage research, phage isolation and characterization, and they were like, okay, this is nice, but it's not state of art, and they think somehow they wouldn't be able to purchase in the needed state of art facilities like PCR. I mean, in the end, we might need it, or we could have just taken it out to like a third party or something, but they were like, that's going to be a lot of money to buy PCR machine, to buy a lot of, I mean, they are neglecting the fact that there could be some already existing tools or machineries. So that was what I want to know. Is it necessary while applying for grants to list everything you have, like down to pipette tips and
right?
Yeah, how detailed should you be or should you not be?
Yeah, that's frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would say in that, and you might not be able to know ahead of time that they're going to have that concern, but now you've learned, and now maybe you can minimally address that in all grants going forward by saying our lab has XYZ in one sentence. The facilities include a PCR machine, blah, blah, blah. We have access to the reagents, whatever. But I will give an example of, even in Europe, sometimes there are, I would say, prejudices that the reviewer has. So we submitted a grant one time where the reviewer said, phage therapy, this was a few years back, phage therapy is never going to be a reality. So this is not realistic. And I see Rami respond, like, sometimes you still have those skeptics out there who are, I had a reviewer one time say, how do we know phages are safe? So we're not going to fund this. And I went back the next time with a letter from the FDA. I got one of my letters of recommendation from somebody at the FDA who said, we consider phages safe, but sometimes somebody just, they aren't fully informed. So you might need to inform them. In some of my grants, for example, to address that, I say the US NIH and the Gates Foundation have funded phage research. And in fact, the US FDA is doing its own phage therapy research to sort of pre-address any of those concerns. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that, but I get it.
I mean, thanks.
And
Your contribution was quite helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing experience. I think we're reaching about time, but I'll check the last question if we can have a quick answer. Have you ever participated in a committee to review? I think that's an important question. From the reviewer point of view, what advice can you tell us? Of course, you told us about clarity and being realistic, but what like the red flags for a reviewer, I think.
Yep.
And,
and I have been on review committees and for a number of different organizations. I don't know how else to put it. Don't annoy your reviewer, don't repeat sentences, like I said, or don't tell me something I already know when the whole call was about phage therapy or the whole call was about AMR. Don't spend most of your time talking about that as the background. Get to the point and teach and tell me what I need to know that's new and unique about your proposal. Because I'm reading 20 of these, or who knows how many. And so yours really needs to stand out quickly.
And possibly don't exaggerate your qualifications either, because some people tend to do this like in a way that the reviewers really know people and they know how to check publication records. So don't say you're. I think
right.
so, right?
Right. I think that's good. Yeah. Well, I hope this is helpful. My goal really
totally.
is to see you get some funding so that you ultimately can save some lives. So I'm excited that as a community you're going to get there.
Yeah, Tobi, that was really amazing. I wish we could extend for a long time, but I know your time is limited and many people are on their way from work or to home. So it was really, really good. And please join me all. We have all these icons. You can use any of them. the reactions, and virtual or literal. Thank you so much. And I already handed the hosting back to Angela. So thank you so much for coming, Tobi, and thank you also Phage Africa for letting me moderate this meeting. And hopefully we will have more people from Africa to join. And it will not be the last contact with Tobi for sure, because she's one of the sponsors of, I mean, the supporters and sponsors of many activities in Africa. So thank you so much one more time. And yeah, everybody's writing their thanks here in the chat. So who is taking back from here, Angela or Noten, to conclude? Angela?
Yeah, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Tobi, for your very nice, elaborate chats. We are closer to the $1 million.
Yes.
It is true. We're actually more like 1.4 million at my last count. Yeah.
For the vegetarian one, you should have said they were grass-fed poultry. But thank you, and thank you for your time. We shall keep you updated for more webinars, and we hope to see most of the listeners at the Evergreen. Hopefully we can get some funding to be able to facilitate the air flights and the
Yes, so I can make the announcement. Yes, Evergreen will be held again this year. It's the 25th meeting, and we will have at least a whole day workshop, if not maybe even 2 days. So it will be August 6th before the meeting starts. There will be a genomics workshop, and many people who do genomic development will be there from Argonne and from other places. So let's practice what we learned now and try to get funding for everybody.
And I know that Betty Cutter and Ria, who's helping to organize Evergreen, we're talking now about seeing if we can get more scholarship funding available for people coming from Lower Africa and Asia. So if you have any ideas for that, please let us know too.
All right. I think we are done. So Tobi, enjoy your nice cup of e-coffee.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Be well, everybody. Have a good evening.
You too.